Dynamic Thought, or the Law of Vibrant Energy, by William Walker Atkinson. Chapter 8. The Forces of Nature. The substance filling the universe is in constant and unceasing motion. Motion is evidenced in every physical and chemical process and change, and manifested in the constant interchange of position of the particles of substance. There is absolutely no rest in nature. Everything is constantly changing, moving, and vibrating. Building up processes are ever at work forming larger masses of bodies of the particles, and tearing down processes, disintegration and decomposition of molecules and atoms and corpuscles are constantly at work also. Nature maintains a constant balance among her forces. If the building up energies and forces were allowed full sway, then all the particles in the universe ultimately would gravitate to a common center, thus forming a compact and solid mass, which would thus dwell for eternity unless the creative power should move upon it and again scatter its particles in all directions. And if the tearing down and dispersive forces and energies were allowed full sway, the particles would fly apart and would remain asunder for eternity, unless called together by some new creative fiat. But Nature pits one force against another, maintaining an equilibrium. The result is constant play and interplay of forces, causing distribution and redistribution of particles, following the gathering together and building up processes. There is no lost motion or waste force. One form of force and motion is converted into another, and so on and on. Nothing is lost, all force is conserved, as we shall see as we proceed. In the public mind, or rather, in the mind of that part of the public which think of the matter at all, there seems to be an idea that Force is something of the nature of an entity, separate from Substance or Mind, something that pounces down upon Substance and drives it along by presence from without. The ancient philosophers regarded Substance as acted upon from without by an entity called Force, Substance being regarded as absolutely inert and dead. This idea, which is still held by the average person, owing, doubtless, to the survival of old forms of expression, was generally held by philosophers until the time of Descartes and Newton. This old idea was due to the teachings of Aristotle, he of the ether theory, and science and philosophy were timid about shaking off the Aristotelian dogmas. Others held that light, heat, and electricity were fluids, conveyed from body to body. In fact, the general public still entertains this idea regarding electricity, owing to the use of the term "the electric fluid." The present teaching of science is that Force is the result of the motion of the particles of Substance, and of course originates from within rather than from without. It is true that motion may be communicated to a body by means of another body in motion, imparting the same to it, but that does not alter the case, for the original motion came from the movement and vibration of the particles of Substance, although it may have passed through many stages of transformation, change, and transmission in its progress. The only exception to the rule is gravitation, which is a form of force, the nature of which is unknown to science, although its laws of operation, etc., are understood. We shall learn some new facts about gravitation in the forthcoming chapters of this book. It will be well for us to remember this fact, in our consideration of Force and Motion, that Force and Motion originate from the inherent property of motion passed by the particles of Substance, and come from within, not from without. This is the best teaching of modern science, and also forms an important part of the theory of Dynamic Thought, which is advanced in this book. Buckner, the author of Force and Matter, vigorously insists upon this conception, saying, among many other similar expressions, Force may be defined as a condition of activity, or a motion of matter, or of the minutest particles of matter, or a capacity thereof. The term Force is generally defined in works on physics as that which causes, changes, or terminates motion. The word Force is generally used in the sense of in action, While energy is usually used in the sense of potential force, capacity for performing work, the idea being that it is stored up force or force awaiting use. The term power is used in two senses, the first meaning a measure of mechanical energy, such as a 40 horsepower engine, etc. The second sense being capacity or ability to act or exercise force. This use being almost identical to the idea of energy as above described, although possibly a little stronger expression. The materialistic school holds that force is a property of matter, the latter being regarded as the real thing of the universe. Others hold that force is the real thing, and that what is called matter or substance is but a center of force, etc. Others hold that the two are but aspects of the same thing, calling the thing by the name matter-force, or force-matter. Haeckel calls the combined thing by the name of substance, claiming that what are called matter and force are but attributes of it, the third attribute being sensation, which he holds is akin to mind. Haeckel's substance is held to be eternal and self-existent, its own cause, in fact. In this book the term substance is not used in this sense, but merely as synonymous with what science usually calls matter. The views advanced in this book differ materially from any of those above mentioned, it being held by the writer that all force is vital mental force, and consequently force, as a separate thing, is considered an unreasonable proposition, what is called force being considered merely an action of mind upon substance, causing motion. The writer does not intend to advance this idea at this point beyond the mere mentioning of the fact, the theory being brought out and developed as we proceed, and he will proceed to a consideration of the phenomena of force along the lines of modern science, believing that in this way the subject may be better understood. The term motion, as used in physics, is defined as the act, process, or state of changing place or position, movement, Webster. So you see, motion is the movement of substance, changing place or position. Force is that which causes, changes, or terminates motion, and energy is the capacity for manifesting force, and power the ability to act. In works on physics you will notice the expression potential energy, meaning energy awaiting action, also kinetic energy, meaning energy in action, that is, in motion. We shall not need these terms in this book, but it is well to understand them. Another term frequently met with is conservation of energy, which is used to indicate the law of physics, the operation of which renders energy indestructible. That is, science holds that energy cannot be destroyed, that it is not lost or created, but is merely transformed into other forms of energy, potential or kinetic. Therefore, after energy is used, it either passes into a state of potential energy or rest, awaiting a future call to activity, or else is immediately transformed into another form of kinetic energy, or energy in action. The theory holds that the quantity or amount of energy in the universe is fixed in its totality, none may be created or destroyed. There can be no addition to or subtraction from the totality of energy, that all energy used has been previously stored up, or else has been immediately transmitted or transformed. It is also held that when energy manifests as the result of work performed, it is always found that it is at the expense of some previously manifested form of energy, that the agency by which the work is performed always parts with its stock of energy, and that the thing worked upon always acquires or gains the amount of energy lost by the aforesaid agent, or worker, and yet there is no actual loss or gain, but merely transformation. The above theory is mentioned as of interest in the general subject, although it does not play a prominent part in the subject of this book, for the writer holds that all energy resides in mind, and emerges therefrom, and in the end returns thereto. This being believed, it is seen that Energy is not to be thought of as a separate thing having a totality, but merely as a quality of Mind. The question of its totality or fixed quantity not being inquired into, although both probably run along the lines of the nature of Mind and depend upon the limitations or lack of limitations of the latter. However, the question does not assume a vital importance in our consideration of the subject. So far as the question of transmission or transformation of Energy is concerned, however, the principles of the Law of Conservation of Energy may be accepted as correct, although it more properly belongs to the principle of what has been called the correlation of Force, the idea of which is that one form of Energy may be, and is always, transformed into another form, and so on, unto infinity. This idea is followed in this book, except that the idea of "from Mind originally to Mind finally" is incorporated within it. This law of the correlation of Force may be illustrated by the following quotation from Tyndall, the great scientist of the last century, who says: "A river, in descending from an elevation of 7,720 feet, generates an amount of heat competent to augment its own temperature 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and this amount of heat was abstracted from the sun in order to lift the matter of the river to the elevation from which it falls. As long as the river continues on the heights, whether in the solid form or as a glacier, or in the liquid form as a lake, the heat expended by the sun in lifting it has disappeared from the universe. It has been consumed in the act of lifting. But, at the moment that the river starts upon its downward course and encounters the resistance of its bed, the heat expanded in its elevation begins to be restored. The mental eye, indeed, can follow the emission from its source through the ether, as vibratory motion, to the ocean, where it ceases to be vibration and takes the potential form among the molecules of aqueous vapor, to the mountain top, where the heat absorbed in vaporization is given out in condensation, while that expended by the sun in lifting the water to its present elevation is still unrestored. This we find paid back to the last unit by the friction along the river's bed, at the bottom of the cascade, where the plunge of the torrent is suddenly arrested, in the warmth of the machinery turned by the river, in the spark from the millstone, beneath the crusher of the miner, in the alpine sawmill, in the milk churn of the chalet, in the supports of the cradle in which the mountaineer, by water power, rocks his baby to sleep. All the forms of mechanical motion here indicated are simply the parceling out of an amount of calorific motion derived originally from the sun, and at each point at which the mechanical motion is destroyed or diminished, it is the sun's heat which is restored." The following quotation also is interesting as illustrating another phase of this law. "The work performed by men and other animals is due to the transformed energy of food. This food is of vegetable origin and owes its energy to the solar rays. The energy of men and animals is, therefore, the transformed energy of the sun. Excepting the energy of the tides, the sun's rays are the source of all the forms of energy practically available. It has been estimated that the heat received by the earth from the sun each year would melt a layer of ice over the entire globe 100 feet in thickness. This represents energy equal to 1 horsepower for each 50 square feet of surface." Anthony and Brackett. From the above quotations, it will be seen that the principal and most familiar sources, or great storage batteries, of energy apparent to dwellers upon this planet are 1. The earth manifesting the power of gravitation, and 2. The sun manifesting solar heat. In Tyndall's illustration we see the force of the sun's energy, heat, raising the water from the ocean, by evaporation, although aided by the earth's gravitation, pulling down the heavier air, allowing the vapor to rise. Then we see the force of gravitation causes the condensed vapor to fall as rain or snow on the mountain top, then causing the rain to run into little streams, and so on until the river is reached. then causing the river to start on its downward journey of over 7,000 feet, then causing it to plunge over the cascade, to turn the wheels that operated the machinery, and turned the millstone, and the crusher of the miner, and the sawmill, and the milk churn, and the cradle. And as Tyndall might have added, had he lived a little later, in the running of the dynamo, which running produced electricity, that in turn caused lights to burn, other machinery to run, and manufacture things, stoves to cook, flat irons to iron, automobiles and engines to run, and many other things along the lines of transmitting energy, force, and motion. And in this consideration, let us not forget the important part that gravitation, that most wonderful of all forces, plays in the grand scheme of nature. Not only does this force cause the planets to circle around the sun, and perhaps that sun around another sun, and so on until the matter becomes unthinkable. Not only this, but it performs 1,000,000 parts in the affair of earthly matter, as we shall see in a later chapter. The force of gravitation is one of the greatest mysteries confronting science today, although many believe it a simple question. Gravitation and the universal ether contain the great secrets of nature that man is striving to unveil. And yet so common is gravitation that the race, including almost all the scientists, take it as a matter of course. We shall devote much attention to the question of gravitation in the forthcoming chapters of this book, for it plays a very important part in the general theory of dynamic thought, upon which this book is based. We shall have a special chapter devoted to it a little later on, and the matter will also come up for explanation further on in the book. But in the meantime, let us consider the other forms of energy, viz., heat, light, magnetism, and electricity, which with gravitation and attraction of other kinds form the forces of nature. End of Chapter 8.